Hi, so I'm just going to go through this logic game. So I'll start off with the diagramming. We have 3 students, and a teacher's going to assign each of them one or more presentations. Okay, so I would probably have the big groups be the students. I do see here that the question is giving you the subjects there, but I guess it just makes more intuitive sense to me to do it this way. And then we'll see how that works out with the rules. And yeah, but let's see, there's going to be at least one presentation on each subject. I suppose it doesn't really matter which way you go about it. I am just going to stick to this one just in case that's what you did, and just show like you can still answer this question even though it shows up a little bit differently. Okay, so the options that we have for the subjects are M, J, and S. Okay, and minimum 1 for each of those, and then we do have a minimum of 1 in each of these groups. So that's just how I would set up the main diagram. Then we have our rules. So if G presents on J, then Rita does as well. And so if R doesn't present on J, then G can't present on J, would be the contrapositive. If R presents on S, then Wendy does not. Okay, so I'm just doing the little slash in front to indicate not. And then the contrapositive would be that if Wendy presents on S, then R does not. And anyone who presents on M also presents on S. So if X, just standing in for anyone, presents on M, then X also presents on S. And if they don't present on S, then they can't present on M. And we do have potential ways of connecting rule 2 and 3. Rule 1, there maybe, is there a bit of a connection there? Not really, because it's just talking about Jitsuaku, which I think I've been calling jujitsu or something. I don't know if I even attempted to pronounce it correctly. Whoops. Yeah, okay. All right, so that's what we've got for our rules. So first question here, excuse me, if a player appears in the M group, they have to be in the S group as well. And that is the case here, right? So George is in the M group and is also in the S group. George and Rita are in M, they're also in S. George and Wendy are in M, but then only George is in S. So this is the one that's going to break that third rule. Okay, so that last rule isn't saying that the M and S groups have to be the same, but just if somebody's in the M group, that person also has to be in the S group, at least the way that it's organized here, right? Okay, and then what else do we have? M. Okay, so this one breaks the rule as well. Or no, it doesn't. No, that one's fine. Sorry. This one breaks the rule. So we have Rita in the M group. So Rita should be in the S group and isn't. So it's okay to have somebody in the S group, but not the M group. It's not okay the other way around. Okay. So those guys for rule 3 are eliminated. If we look at rule 1, if we have George here, we also should have Rita. And so we can eliminate D because of that. We should have Rita, not Wendy. Or Rita and Wendy potentially. Okay, and then if Rita presents on Shakespeare's villains, which happens in B, then Wendy shouldn't. So we can eliminate B, and the correct answer is A. And now we get to actually write that out in our format so we can use it as an acceptable solution. Pardon the yawning. Okay, so George has all three, right? J, sorry, I'm going to do them in the order I have up there, M, J, and S, and then R, just J, and W, just S. So yeah, George M therefore has S. George has J, therefore R does as well. And W has S, so R doesn't. So yeah, all of that works. Okay. Cool, cool, cool. And yeah, we're using each of them, at least once. Both the groups and the different types of presentations. Okay, which one of the following cannot be a complete and accurate list of the students presenting on Machiavellianism? Ooh, okay. So if you present on Machiavellianism, what do we know? So I'm starting out here by just looking at in the question, are they giving me any clues as to what's going to be relevant? And they're talking about Machiavellianism. I'm going to look at the rule that has to do with that and how can I connect that potentially to another rule to make a deduction that is going to help me decide what's not allowed. And the thing that we see with that is that if you present on Machiavellianism, you also have to present on Shakespeare's villains. If R presents on Shakespeare's villains, W can't. If W can't, R can't. So they can't do it together, right? So if they can't present on Shakespeare's villains together, they can't present on Machiavellianism together because that would, result in this chain of events through those conditional rules. So Rita and Wendy, that's going to be the correct answer because that's going to be prohibited by the connection between rule 2 and 3. If Wendy presents on exactly 2 of the subjects, okay, so Wendy could present on M and then present on S. That's possible. Okay, so what are my options here? Wendy present on M and S. If Wendy presents on S, then R doesn't. And if R doesn't present on S, R can't present on M either. So R would present on J. And then G would be able to pretty much present on whatever. So G isn't really stuck in this scenario with anything. So just because R presents on J doesn't mean that G has to as well. It goes the other way around, right? So R presenting on J is not actually a trigger for that rule and wouldn't involve rule 1. It's a consequence if we know that J presents on, G presents on J. But yeah, so looking at this right away, I know that this question-specific condition, if Wendy presents on exactly 2 of the subjects, is not going to cause a chain reaction where it must be true that George does anything. George is open-ended at that point. Okay. It's also not going to create a condition where R has to present on S because we see that that doesn't have to be true just based on this one example. And so based on one example, we've been able to show that A, B, C, and E all could be false. And so that's enough to show that they're not the correct answer. And therefore, R does have to present on J just by process of elimination. We do have an acceptable scenario here and kind of a range of acceptable scenarios because we know G has lots of options. Okay, moving on. Question 22, if George presents only on J. All right, so George presents on J, R, W, R has to present on J as well. There's nothing really that would force George to present on anything else. R presenting on J is going to give us a bit of an issue between R and W because we do have to have each of the subjects be presented on at least once, right? There will be at least one presentation on each subject. So that's where the fact that George only presents on J is actually going to become an issue, because either R or W has to present on the other subjects. So if R presents on S, W can't. And so we could potentially like run into an issue there. So let's give that a try. So R presents on S, W can't present on S, and therefore can't present on M, and therefore presents on J, which is fine. R and W can't have S in common, and because of rule 3, that means they also can't have M in common, but it's okay for them to both present on J. That's actually allowed. There's nothing wrong with that. R would have to present on M, not because if it presents on S, or if she presents on S, then she has to present on M. That's not the issue. That's not why we come to that conclusion. We actually come to that conclusion here because we're trying a scenario where R presents on S. And when that happens, W doesn't. If W doesn't present on S, then W also doesn't present on M. We know from the question specific condition that G can't present on M because G only presents on J, Jitsuaku. And someone has to present on M. So we've ruled out W and G, therefore R is the only one left, and R would have to present on M. So in this scenario, that's why we end up where we do. We can stamp this as an acceptable solution, but this is not the only acceptable solution. Okay, this is a could be true question. So we're just looking for something that's possible. This is one of multiple possibilities. I would try the other scenario, which is if W presents on S, right? So G presents on J, which means R has to, based on rule 1. If W presents on S, then R can't present on S, which means R can't present on M, and we're in the same situation where W has to present on M because there's no other spot for M to be. Does W have to present on J? No. Could W present on J? Yes, there's nothing restricting that. So I would just have J with a question mark there. In the first scenario that we created, W had to present on J because it has to present on something. And S and M were out based on the contrapositive of rule 3 and the fact that we were trying out a scenario where R presents on S. So this is another potential scenario. Okay, so ideally, this would be something that you would be able to do relatively quickly. So you would see the consequences of G presenting only on J. You would see quickly that that's going to trigger rule 1, put that down, and then you're going to go, okay, what's left over? I have to make sure that S and M go somewhere. Well, if I put S with R, it's not with W, and vice versa. Well, let's try S with R, let's try S with W. Let's just split those worlds and create those possibilities, and you would apply the rules as necessary. And then you've created all of the potential solutions, and so you know for sure one of the answer choices is going to match up. If you did want to check the answer choices once you have one full scenario, that's totally reasonable, right? Like maybe you don't have to create that second scenario. And in fact, with this one, you wouldn't have to create it because C is the correct answer. That is a possibility for the first scenario that we've created. I think this is a better way to go about it rather than creating the A scenario until you find that it breaks a rule, then creating the B scenario until you find it breaks a rule, then creating the C scenario and realizing that's possible. I think that takes more time than having like a bit of a plan where you end up creating like 2 alternate scenarios based on the question specific condition, and then you find out which of those matches up to an answer choice, and the answer is C. So typically I would say do the work up front using the rules, and then you'll just be searching for the answer that you already have done the work for. That's usually going to serve you better, and then you're creating these acceptable solutions that you can potentially use later. We haven't really used them very much so far, but I do think that this was a bit of a learning opportunity, and I do think that starting with the rules every time, like always going back to the rules, helps to like keep them in your working memory for the duration of the game, and helps you not to be like making mistakes and misinterpreting them. Certainly not for very long before you would like catch that mistake, because you're always going back to the rules every time, making sure that you've got them and they're working for you. All right, last one. So if Wendy presents on J and S, but not M, so do we have a scenario where that happens? So we don't, right? We have scenarios. We have like this scenario here where W presents on M. We have this scenario where W presents on M, and we have this scenario where W does not present on S. What we do have, though, is one where W presents on S, not M, but could present on J, right? So we could actually throw a J in there, and then we have like kind of a scenario that we could maybe play off of. But once again, I would probably create the scenario based on this new information that I've got. Just put that in, see what rules are triggered, and go from there. So J, S, not M. Okay, so W presents on J, doesn't trigger anything. W presents on S does trigger that R can't present on S. If R doesn't present on S, then R doesn't present on M, right? X is just a stand-in for whatever group, right? Whatever player. If R doesn't present on S and doesn't present on M, we do have a spot that we have to fill for R. So R would have to present on J. If R presents on J, that doesn't trigger anything. G is open-ended except for one thing. G absolutely must present on M because R and W do not, and someone has to present on M, right? There will be at least one presentation on each subject. So G presents on M, which means G also presents on S, right? Rule 3. The fact that G presents on S doesn't trigger anything. So we've kind of run out in terms of our like linking up those conditional statements. G could present on J, nothing wrong with that, right? We already know that R presents on J. So, if G presents on J, that's not going to pose an issue. We're not going to end up breaking rule 1. G doesn't have to present on J because the rule doesn't go backwards, right? But G could. So J is an option for G. Okay, so now we've really only got 2 options, right? We've got one where G presents on J and one where G does not. All right, so A, George presents on Shakespeare's villains, but on neither J nor M. That's not going to work. George presents on M and S, but not J. That's the correct answer. And we don't even have to read the other ones. We've already confirmed that that could be true. Okay, so that's it for this game. I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions.